What's up, everybody? Welcome back into the Play the Fight Song family and into the Iowa fan perspective. We're starting a new series here, as you've seen on our Iowa State stuff. We're going to do some Iowa opponent previews. We're going to jump into our first one here with Rutgers, one of the first Big Ten matchups that the Hawks have here in 2025. And covering Rutgers here for us is David Anderson of Off Tackle Empire, a frequent guest on the Scarlet Faithful, as well as Night Watch. Appreciate you joining us, David. Happy to have you. And, really excited to get to learn a little more about Rutgers, as I feel, and we were just talking a little bit before the show here, is it's a fan base that's very prevalent, very excited about what's going on in the football program and athletics in general in some spots, but feel like it doesn't get the same light that some other Big Ten programs have. And we're happy to cover that here as they are on Iowa's schedule here in 2025. How are we doing today?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me, JP.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, kind of talk to me about how you got started covering Rutgers or a Rutgers fan and kind of where all this came from and, just your feeling on the university and the school itself.
Sure. So I'm a New Jersey native. I don't live there now, been pretty much everywhere else. But my mom was a gymnastics captain for 2 years, and then my dad was the catcher on one of Rutgers' few baseball conference title teams. So I was kind of born into it. And so we used to go to all the
Mhm.
homecomings and things like that, uh, various sports. Basketball, football, etc. And then I started with the On the Banks blog, which is part of Vox Media, before I transitioned over to Off Tackle Empire, which is also Vox Media.
Awesome. Awesome. So your dad being a baseball player, a lot of us that from the Play the Fight Song family actually played baseball, not at the high level as your father did, apparently here. We played some NAI baseball. I don't know if there's that much of that out there in the Northeast, but that's awesome. That's a great connection there. Um, when talking Rutgers and thinking Rutgers athletics, I know we talked about the AD situation, kind of not having one for the last year or so, and whatever that process is. And I'm sure your fans and listeners a little more familiar with that situation. What has that kind of done for the fan base looking at the Rutgers athletic program? And it's a program that's gotten better in hoops, a really good fan base there, an arena that gets a lot of hype for being one of the tougher ones to play in within the Big Ten. Football wise, it's been growing under Schiano's second stint. Kind of how is everybody feeling about the athletic department and then football specifically, the state of the program?
Yeah, I mean, if you rewind the clock back a year, in several Rutgers sports, including men's basketball and football, they were lined up for their best season possibly ever by certain metrics.
Mhm.
And so then early August, there's a huge scandal with the athletic director, Pat Hobbs, which is now the third athletic director that was involved in a scandal in a row at Rutgers. And so when he wasn't, um, getting things done with the gymnastics coach off the field, he really wasn't doing a lot of fundraising. His chief fundraiser had left for a similar position at Texas. And so we didn't really see that, like, behind the scenes, things were crumbling in certain ways. But on the field, you saw football had the easiest schedule that
Mhm.
they'll probably ever have in the Big Ten. There was the first year Rutgers didn't face Michigan, Ohio State, or Penn State, teams who they had combined to go 1-29 against in their first 10 years in the conference. And then they also avoided Iowa and Oregon, who we were pretty confident would be near the top of the conference. So Rutgers fans, from a football standpoint, were kind of thinking, hey, if everything breaks right, we're basically going to be what Indiana became, which is that sneaky team that
Mhm.
didn't really beat anybody good and could have snuck into the college football playoff. So that was kind of where it was from a football standpoint. From a men's basketball standpoint, I mean, you have two top five NBA picks, really two of the top three talents without a doubt.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's some bizarreness with the Ace Bailey, agent situation, but you got to figure all you have to do is fill in with some complementary pieces. You have a coach who's been to multiple NCAA tournaments. Like, we were feeling confident that this, you know, if they didn't reach the Sweet 16, it was going to be a failure, and they
Yeah.
didn't even finish 500. So, I mean, talk about all-time colossal failure. You could say maybe the biggest failure in the history of college basketball. It's going to be talked about in that realm. So that kind of all happened, and it was just like one thing after another when it came to Rutgers sports. Meanwhile, you have women's soccer, which is like one of the good programs, a nice bounce back, but kind of goes unnoticed because men's soccer is just a lot of prima donnas, unfortunately. And so, like, all of the teams pretty much did not reach where they've been in the last like 5 years near their peak. and several of them we really hope they could.
Mhm.
Especially football and men's basketball. Women's basketball has been a mess for a while now. After previously being a very strong program, after C. Vivian Stringer came over from coaching Iowa, being a
Yep.
legendary coach, and then coming over to Rutgers, so that program had been strong, and now it's not. So really, I mean, I think in the Directors Cup standings, Rutgers finishes like 80th. And all to wrap your point with to say that a year ago, everybody was optimistic. And now it just feels like, you hear this with certain professional teams like same old Jets or same old Lions or same old Bears or whatever. It's like same old Rutgers. And that's kind of where the fan base feels at this point across the entire sports landscape that we have at Rutgers.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting to look at like that the state athletic department and how fans feel about it. I mean, Iowa's been in the same spot like before the hire of Beth Getz. Like it was kind of the same thing where people were just kind of fed up with things not going the way they're expected to go, or maybe underachieving is the bigger underlying thing there. Rutgers in football specifically, talking Greg Schiano, what
Yeah.
is the pulse around the fan base around this guy? Second stint at the program, responsible for probably one of the better runs this program's ever had, and they're building, and it's pretty obvious, I think, to a lot of people around the Big Ten that this is building into something. It's just what is the cap, and when do they maybe get to that next step? What is your feeling on that? And then maybe if you're listening to
Yeah.
people who listen to your stuff or read your stuff, what is their feeling towards it?
Yeah, so Greg Schiano has led Rutgers to 9 of the 13 bowl appearances in school history, and 3 of the remaining 4 were rosters that he recruited as true freshmen. So they pretty much have only been to one game with a team that he didn't build in the entire history of the program, dating back to 1869, the first college football game, which everyone's sick of hearing about, right?
Mhm.
So when it came to whether Greg Schiano should come back or not in 2019, basically, it was very split in the fan base. And now I think pretty much everyone's on board for 2 reasons. One, because they realize that he has learned from a lot of the mistakes that he made the first time around. And then also with the way college football is evolving, it's actually accentuated his strengths more than we realized when he was rehired. And
Mhm.
so it took a couple of years, but they've been to back-to-back bowl games. And for a school that's strapped for money, when you compare it to other Big Ten institutions, it's kind of like if you sell your house, and I'm a realtor as one of my jobs. It's like if you sell your house when the market's up, you still got to buy a new house. And so it's kind of like, well, if they were to let him go, who are you going to get? Unless you can be sure you're going to get someone like Frank Signetti, whose
Mhm.
father was actually an offensive coordinator at Rutgers, to do like what happened at Indiana. Like, unless you're sure you got somebody like that, like it's really not a smart thing to roll the dice. And so people are kind of aligned now, and I think if anyone is like a unifier of the state in general, it has been Greg Schiano, and he's pulled it off for the second time.
He does feel like a guy who loves Rutgers and wants to be there, and I think that goes a long ways. And a lot of college football programs, especially one, like Rutgers, like you're talking, like the money may not be there compared to other schools, but it's a proud fan base. It's a school that's wants athletic success and has seen athletic success in a lot of things. Um, so looking at kind of what they were last year and maybe falling short of expectations, and then rolling it into this year, it seems like the talent is there in a lot of spots. There's a lot of turnover and like star power, maybe, but there's a
Right.
lot of guys who have returning production returning this year on both sides of the football. Some pieces maybe that are younger that may not get as many snaps. That if you project them out, they look like they can be something here down the road. So looking at 2025, and let's start on the offensive side of the ball here.
Sure.
Kaliak Manis returns. And then you have one waiting in the wings that seems to get a lot of buzz. And I kind of listened to some of your stuff here on the Scarlet Faithful and what the talk is in AJ Cervais.
Surace. Yeah.
Cervais.
Yeah.
There's one waiting in the wings. You had one that was pretty good last year for you. And then you lose Manungai, obviously one of the best backs in the Big Ten in recent history. In a lot of ways, I think he goes underappreciated in some ways because he was at Rutgers and he wasn't at a Penn State or a Michigan or whatnot. That feels like how that goes a lot within this conference. There are pieces there, but how would you project out this offense and maybe what things are going to look like here in 2025?
Yeah. So this is gonna be the first year since probably 2008 that Rutgers is more pass centric. Maybe 2014 that Rutgers is more pass centric than they are a running team. And yeah, I mean the big question is like you mentioned about losing the star power. The offense has almost everyone back except maybe their three best people. I mean, at least their two best in Kyle Monangai and left tackle Holland Pierce.
Mhm.
They're the two best players on the offense last year, and they're gone. Now, from an offensive line perspective, Rutgers lost games to, for example, Nebraska last year in an absolute dogfight that was pretty much a pathetic display of offensive football. And they've lost to teams like Iowa in the last couple of times they played them just because just man on man, they were not as developed. And when you look at where they are right now, so again, if you talk offensive line, they have six guys who are back who have started Big Ten games that Rutgers has won, which for some Big Ten teams, you're like, it's kind of laughable that I even have to bring that up. But for a team like Rutgers, who's never won more than 4 conference games in a season, with that being last year, I
Mhm.
mean, that's a huge thing. Like we've gone through the Chris Ayers era where they didn't win a Big Ten game 3 out of 4 years. So the problem on the offensive line is they don't really have any 4-star or 5-star talents. So really they're kind of maxed out where they can be, which is another reason why without an engine like Kyle Monangai, you really aren't going to be blowing holes open with like big maulers in the trenches they don't have a Brendan Scherf. Like they don't have
Mhm.
anyone like that on their roster that Tristan Wirfs or whatever. Like they have to rely on these maybe medium to high 3-star prospects that offensive line coach Pat Flaherty, who is an line coach for the New York Giants when they went to recent 2 Super Bowls, is developing, but they're kind of capped out without bringing in more talent there. So what does that mean? That means you kind of have to play more of an open style of football if you're playing against a schedule that includes Iowa, Oregon, Ohio
Mhm.
State, Penn State, that if you just try to run the ball straight ahead like they did against them 2 years ago, clearly it's not going to go well. So from a passing standpoint, Cal McManus was brought in to be a game manager last year, but because they had to score more points, they kind of had to turn him loose mid-season, and
Yep.
then he turned in his best collegiate campaign. So he's got some receivers. I wouldn't say anybody is a unbelievable talent. They have DT Sheffield coming from North Texas as a transfer who, I mean, for Iowa fans who remember New Jersey and Amir Smith Marset, like I don't
Yep.
think he's a complete player, especially right now, but that is an element that they haven't had in the pass game. And so even though they lose Dymere Miller, who was their best receiver last year, they have some big guys in Ian Strong and KJ Duff. And then if you can add in some speed guys and kind of leverage and have more at your disposal, hopefully you can throw the ball. And then they've got serviceable running backs, but they don't have a Kalman guy. They don't have an Isaiah Pacheco
Yeah.
or even a Raheem Blackshear, who's also in the NFL that all passed through Rutgers recently. So from the offensive standpoint, they have the firepower to make a comeback. I mean, Rutgers they've made like 2 comebacks of more than like
Mhm.
2 touchdowns in their history of joining the Big Ten. So at least they give themselves a shot, but I don't think that they're going to be able to just will their way through victories like they thought they could last year and clearly figured out midseason they couldn't.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought up the running backs because it is something to look at. And people always, I feel like when a star running back leaves a place, there's always the conversation of, oh, well, who gets the carries? And it's always a conversation of one person. Well, it might have to be by committee in situations. Those, X amount of carries and over 1,000 yards, whatever, aren't one person. You might split them between 2 or 3. So looking at CJ Campbell, Antoine Raymond, some other guys, they're not the star power, but are they serviceable enough to maybe, work their way into combining for that kind of production?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, they probably could. And if you look back at last year's schedule, they beat Minnesota, who's the best team they beat, and the only team they've ever beaten since joining the Big Ten Conference that finished with a winning conference record. So again,
Yeah.
we got to put things in perspective. They have never beaten a team with a winning conference record in the Big Ten since they joined the conference. So, and that was a game that Kyle Monangai was injured, could not play, and they were still
Mhm.
able to win on the backs of Antoine Raymond, who should have been his high school senior and enrolled early. I mean, early, like a
Yeah.
year early, not just early spring enrollment. And then Jashawn Benjamin, who kind of adds a little bit of a quick burst to his step. And then they add TJ Campbell because really what they've lacked since they've had Blackshear is a running back who can actually catch passes out of the backfield and be a threat. They're really
Yeah.
not a threat on checkdowns. And so, especially if you're going to be trailing in a lot of games like we expect they will be based on their schedule this year, you're going to have to get some yards that way. And not only did they not have the backs, they didn't have a quarterback who could just,
Mhm.
throw a dump off, which is insane to say. But I mean, we're talking about a team that the previous 2, maybe 3 years had the lowest completion percentage from their quarterbacks of any Power 5, now Power 4 team. Like, so to say, I was listening to the BYU preview with
Yeah.
on your show, and they were talking about, well, their quarterback didn't have a 65% completion percentage. It's like, dude, we didn't even have 55 for a
Hey,
couple of years
yeah,
here.
you're talking to an Iowa guy too. I feel like we're on the
Right.
same
Like,
page here. It's like we're just begging for, average here. We're looking for things to move forward in some way to see some kind of progress at the position. So
right.
it's a tough one to kind of explain to people. We're like, but anytime, you kind of get on an arguing point with them about a team or like you feel like something's getting better, that's always a point thrown back in your face, right? So like you try to like talk about it and like address the situation and then it gets thrown back into you anyway. Um, talking about like the offensive line, like you touched on, it feels like they're capped at that. And it wasn't a bad group last year. Maybe it was a situation where they felt like, Cali McManus had to move around a little bit more in the pocket and wasn't as settled, but later in the year it got better and better. I think with it bringing in Sheffield, you kind of look at now you have big bodies on the outside. You can be possession type, and then Sheffield is hopefully going to be that guy who can break something over the top,
Right.
just making it a balance, making it be respected by an opposing defense. Because I think Iowa and Rutgers are on the same side here, where that hasn't been a guy on either one of their rosters in a while. You brought up ISM, like that's the last true go out and beat somebody deep guy that Iowa's had, and Sheffield's that hope for Rutgers this year. If you are looking at what the difference are like in production wise. Is it a better offense this year based on just some returning production and like they fill some holes, or is it more likely that they drop down maybe a little bit below their numbers? Because I'm not expecting it to be a poor unit by any means, but is it, I don't want to say on par just for the sake of the question. Is it going to be a little bit better, or a little bit worse than it was this season ago
I think the
statistically?
offense will be actually slightly better if you were to look at like a neutral field against a neutral opponent. But because of the schedule, I think their numbers would be worse. I mean, one
Yeah,
of the things like I mentioned in that game Rutgers lost to Iowa. I mean, the 2 years ago game was kind of weird and slow and a
it
slugfest.
was
But the
disgusting.
game
Yeah.
that happened at Rutgers in 2022, where it was like a Friday night game similar to what we're gonna have
I
this
think that
year.
was like a DeJean pick six that had to seal that late. It was,
That was like a turning point, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, it ended up being 3 Rutgers interceptions. One was on the last play, but the DeJean one was like Iowa had nothing going, and then he made that game
yeah.
changing play, and then Rutgers kind of sputtered for a little bit. But I mean, all to say that Rutgers offense doesn't have the offensive lineman to bully you in the trenches. And when you talk about depth against these more bigger teams, like they can't sustain it. I mean, what happened last year with the offensive line was that they lost 2 starters for the year pretty early on in Brian Felter and Tyler Needham, and it took a few games for their replacements to get their feet wet. Once they were, you look at that backstretch of the season, and Rutgers won 3 of 4, and the only game they
Mhm.
lost was because they made the worst coaching decision I've seen, other than like for not taking a knee, Mario Cristobal style.
Yeah,
But the worst coaching decision ever to try to ice a kicker on a 58-yard kick into 25-mile-an-hour winds, which they ultimately didn't kick. I mean, they would have been 4-0 in their last 4 games, regular season,
for sure.
um, after that line gelled, to your point. So, I mean, I think the offense will be better, but I also think their floor is lower because you don't have Monungai. I mean, it's hard to really explain how important a guy like that is as an
Mhm.
engine of your offense, a heartbeat of your offense. And you never really know how you're going to replace that. Like,
Yeah,
will Ian Strong step up as a go-to guy? I hope, but you never know. Like, if one of these guys can really be that guy to make that big play, that Monungai, they might have give up 3rd and 7 runs and he'd get it,
yeah,
or a giveaway 3rd and 15. You throw him one of his like 10 receptions for the year and he gets it. Like that type of flip this script. I don't know if they have anyone on this offense, but hopefully they have several guys. We just will find out in the fall.
for sure, for sure. Before we jump into the defense, just want to make sure we give a shout out to our sponsor here, No Rivals, shopnorivals.com. Use code PTFS on branded collegiate hatwear. As you can see, I have the upside down collection on right now for Iowa. Rutgers isn't on there yet, but feel free to go on there and request Rutgers be added. Ton of good stuff there. Always appreciate them sponsoring the show here on all the Play the Fight Song Network shows. Defensively, I think we look at what Rutgers has been, and it feels like it's been a group that's been pretty solid throughout the years. They've had some pieces in the linebacking core and even in the DBs the last few years where it's like there's a lot of talent on it. This year, what's the difference between maybe what to expect out of this year's defense and last year's defense? Is there one key thing that you feel like needs to be highlighted?
Well, if you go back a year ago, right, at this time, Rutgers had 11 returning starters on defense, everyone. And then they lost their best defensive player in Mo Toure,
Mm-hmm.
who had announced he was coming back. Ended up, he's not really 100%, ends up transferring to Miami. So you end up with Daryl Jabome, or he's known as DJ Jabome. He'll be representing Rutgers at Big Ten Media Days today
Mm-hmm.
as we're recording this. Make a lot of plays, but also miss a lot of plays. And when you look at their defense, they were fooled into their schedule in 2023, where they only really played one team that was a pass first team in 2023, and that was Maryland. And
Yeah.
so even though, they lost games, they were close, Penn State, Iowa were one score games in the fourth quarter. The game wasn't really close. Like there was really no way Rutgers could come back, but they
Mm-hmm.
were fooled into thinking that their defense was better than it was because they had all this returning production and they didn't face any pass heavy teams. Once teams realized, like, just keep chucking it, even if we got a 2-score lead, don't stop. Like in the case of USC, for example, I mean, that they had no answer. So really the big issue, there's two big issues. One, that they run a 4-2-5, and anyone who runs that type of defense, you're kind of reliant on your you need an AJ Epinesa or somebody
Yeah.
who's a pass rusher that can also play the run as one of those end spots. And right now they don't really have anyone who's both plus against run and pass, or even maybe average against run and plus against pass, or in the reverse, right? They don't really have anyone that meets those criteria. So you're kind of going to have to roll the dice and gamble that you get a little bit lucky. You can scheme up some blitzes here and there, and that things work out. Because last year they were so banged up on the defensive line. Keontae Hamilton, who ended up getting drafted, was a defensive tackle, had to play defensive end out of necessity. And so basically, and they didn't have linebackers that were comfortable blitzing per se. And so it was a mess in that regard. So once they kind of mixed up with some DB blitzes and things like that, things got a little better down the back end. But ultimately, if you could get the ball to the perimeter on a run,
Mm-hmm.
you were going for big yardage. And so
Yeah.
really, to circle back to your question, the difference is that they're not under the delusion that they have pass rushers. It doesn't seem like they were last year. They're not under the delusion that they have like shutdown DBs that can go step for step with any receiver. And so they're going to have to play more, uh, tactical football when it comes to blitzing strategically,
Yeah.
occasionally being willing to give up a big play, because you can't just sit back and let teams beat you. And so the difference is that they've got more speed in the defensive backfield, may not as much. Their plays may not be as good as DBs, in terms of football skills, but just their pure catch up speed may be enough to
Yeah.
reduce the number of 20 plus, yard plays that they give up and explosive plays in the run and pass game. So that's really the hope, is that the defense won't be a sieve because they'll give up less 20 plus yard plays.
Yeah, when you look at like the defense and what I've seen just like reading through some Rutgers stuff and watching some stuff, a lot of new position coaches, right? A lot of transfers have to hit on the back end. And you touched on the pass rush element. And I think that's a great point because that is something that, you wouldn't just find anywhere when you're trying to figure out maybe why defense isn't clicking in certain spots. Is there a spot or a position group on this team that you feel like is going to still be a headliner? Like they may not have a star quite, before a season starts, but is there a position group you feel is really going to have to be the all important trying to keep this defense together?
I don't think they have it. I mean, to be honest, like they're going to
Mm,
have probably 4 new starters on the defensive line. I mean, you're probably your best bet is defensive tackle because they return plenty of pieces who are serviceable enough against the run. And again, that's kind of one thing that goes crazily unnoticed when you look at how poorly they were last year. Teams weren't running straight up the gut on them. Now, maybe they would have been if it was Penn State or something
yeah.
because of the schedule, right? But I mean, if you look at the bowl game, Kansas State couldn't do anything in the middle. They were just tossing or running triple option outside, and the few runs they got up the middle were just because they were trying to protect against the outside. It was more just perimeter runs killing
Yeah.
them over and over and over again. So really they have some guys who are rotational pieces coming back, and then they've got some transfers, like Blue Eli, for example. But it's really the depth at that defensive tackle spot that's going to prevent them from teams just running it straight down their throat,
Yeah.
and that's really what we're hoping for on a defense. But and then they've got good DB coaches, so we're pretty confident, in the cornerback room, even if there's a lot of
Yeah.
turnover.
Because it sounds like you have some transfers coming in from different spots that, may not have that top end ability, but it is a good addition in that they can be starters and they can find a way to be a role player with on this team. And maybe that's all it takes for a Rutgers defense is just finding a lot of role players that fit into a scheme and really buy into that. And that goes a long ways. And then defense, I feel like we talk about a lot on our show is a lot of it is coaching and just getting guys into position. Like there is a lot of times that a coaching change defensively can help you out so much and just maybe simplifying something for a certain group, whether that's a DB or a linebacker group that's running the defense, simplifying things, or maybe just a change in scenery of coaching can help a group out a ton year to year. Talking about the DBs specifically, you're talking about how they don't maybe have like a pure lockdown corner or a safety that may be great over the top. Is there one specifically maybe that's new to the roster transferring or a guy that's homegrown a little bit more that needs to be highlighted and maybe explained to like this is the guy that might be your even if he's not the top of the top,
Yeah.
he may have to be the one-on-one, guy that's out there guarding certain
Well,
guys.
yeah, I mean, from a one-on-one perspective, he kind of got run out of town in Penn State because of what happened during the playoffs. But Cam Miller is
Mhm.
going to have to be one of their top corners. So that's, I wouldn't say a steal, but that's a guy who's, if you're in the rotation at Penn State, a team
Yeah.
that was poor coaching away from being in the national title game,
Yeah, they're with
then
you.
you're there, right? I mean, and then say this, and then the same token, they also picked up Jacoby Henderson from Marshall, which is kind of a
Mhm.
bizarre situation. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with that, but it's basically like they didn't renew their coach, and everyone was like, "What?"
Yeah.
And so then a lot of guys entered the transfer portal, not for lack of playing time or anything, but just because of the just bizarre situation down there with the
Yeah,
Thundering Herd.
now they're all a Southern Miss with him.
Oh, a lot of them, yeah.
Yeah.
So like they kind of Rutgers is very good in football at like finding those like little advantages. Like you'd say in economics, you'd talk about like producer surplus or consumer
Yeah.
surplus. It's like these little edges on the margins, which I think is something that makes Iowa always kind of stand a little bit above, some of their other former Big Ten West competition. And so those are two guys who are probably gonna have to do it. And really, from a safety perspective, the only guy returning with any experience is Kyle Sanders, who's a New Jersey guy from Brigham Catholic, and he's got the physical ability. He was playing as a true freshman, and hopefully by having Jet Elad, the transfer from UNLV, who just won his eligibility decision, who's kind of like that speed guy, who's your deep safety. Sanders can play a little closer to the line and make bigger hits because he's really not cut out to be that deep safety. And
Mhm.
so hopefully, like what you talk about, kind of fitting more pieces to a puzzle, almost like playing a Moneyball type defense. Like they feel more like they have on both sides of the ball guys with varying skill sets for the coaching staff. So in the hands
Yeah.
of a bad coaching staff, that's not good, but in the hands of a good coaching staff, that can be a really, really good thing because you just got more of your bases covered, and that's really the hope on this team right now.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we talked about the schedule and touched on it a little bit. Let's look at it here together. Ohio, Miami of Ohio, Norfolk State, right? We have a chance to start here 3-0 and probably the expectation of getting 3-0 before hosting Iowa in Piscataway. I think you guys talked about it on a couple different spots. There's a 3-game stretch in here in 4 weeks at the beginning of Big Ten play that feels like it's make or break if you want to get to 6 or 7 wins, right? It's Iowa, it's at Minnesota, at Washington all in a row because I feel like the
Yep.
back half of that schedule gets a little tougher. Like obviously Purdue and Maryland mixed in the back end feel like those are gettable, winnable games, but you also have it sandwiched between Oregon, Illinois, Ohio State, Penn State. Your expectation for this team, maybe a hot spot on the schedule you feel like is a must win, and then where should fans expect to be here? Is 6-6, 7-5 a real expectation, or the expectation of a bowl game feels like a little far fetched at this moment in time with this schedule?
I would say the fan base at this point is generally optimistic. We're kind of a fan base that gets juiced up from January until about now. and then training camp happens, and everyone starts to feel a little bit more nervous. And then right before the season, there's like more optimism again. So, like you said, if you break down the schedule,
Mhm.
they don't have a power four opponent, which I generally think is, filthy to not do that. But in this example, their schedule is so tough. This team is not ready to, go on the road and face, I don't know, like Miami or something,
Yeah.
as that other of Miami, Florida, I should say. So instead, we get Miami of Ohio, and Miami of Ohio and Ohio, I believe, were the two teams in the MAC championship game last year.
Yep.
So
And both
you're dealing with
top of
two
this year
better
too.
MAC teams. Both those games they should win, but it's entirely possible that they don't. Especially, your week one game is always a roll of the dice, right? But yeah,
Mhm.
the expectation is they're 3-0. Then when you look at that middle section of the schedule, um, Iowa's an interesting one because, like, especially on Off Tackle Empire, there was a nice graph a couple years ago of like how Iowa are you and how Iowa do you think you are, and Rutgers is always thinking they're Iowa until they face Iowa and realizing, hey, we're not there yet,
Mhm.
and so that's going to be a huge litmus test for where this team is. But to your point, they're not beating Oregon, Ohio State, or Penn State this year. They can't. There's no way. So then there's 3 games that are guaranteed losses. Iowa's probably the next toughest that they don't necessarily think they can win, but this is the first year where I feel like Rutgers isn't going to just try to beat Iowa at their own game.
Yeah.
Every other time they've played them since joining the conference, they tried to beat Iowa at their own game and lost. The only game that was even close really was that 14-7 game when Janarian Grant broke his ankle when
Mhm.
King like stepped on it, and then Rutgers couldn't punch it in, and Grant was lost for the season. I don't know if you remember that. It was like
Yep.
2016
Yep.
game. Desmond King, I think his name is.
Yep. Desmond King.
Yeah. So that was the only game that was even a one score game, really. So I guess there's optimism that Rutgers could knock off Iowa, and they have to take 2 of those 3 games. They
Yeah.
did beat Washington and Minnesota last year, but both were at home. Both these are on the road. Washington's going to be better. I'm not sure about Minnesota. PJ
Yeah.
Fleck is a Schiano disciple. So
Uh,
really, like we're talking about, you really got to be
yeah.
5-1, 4-2 maybe, because assuming you could beat Purdue and Maryland during that second half.
Mhm.
But again, the schedule's brutal, like you said. I mean, you get Purdue, but it's sandwiched between Oregon and Illinois. Illinois, they should have beat last year, but that's going to be on the road. Illinois is probably better than they were a year ago. Rutgers maybe worse. So you can't guarantee that they're going to win. And even Maryland, like they beat them last year, but they had been embarrassed by them 3 prior years.
Yeah.
So you know, it's possible that they could start 4-0 and finish 4-8. Like that's entirely possible. I think the fan base expectation is somewhere between 5-7, 6-6.
Yeah.
And to me, I would think 6-6, but you're always going to lose a game that you probably should have won last year. That probably was the Wisconsin game when they didn't even show up and got embarrassed.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, most people are probably thinking 5-7, 6-6 range. But again, if you think 6-6, that usually means one lower. If you think 5-7, that really might be a 4-8 campaign.
Yeah. I I like the idea. We kind of talked about the Iowa, Minnesota, Washington bundle. I kind of feel like if I'm Rutgers, I'm looking at more so getting Iowa at home, that being more winnable than traveling cross country and playing Washington, because all the way we've seen the east to west travel a billion times, and now in the new Big Ten, it's inevitable. Nobody likes it. It's just something you have to deal with. It's also Seattle is a heck of a place to play. Like it's a real deal. The difference in what the expectation is traveling to a Purdue is, and then traveling out to Seattle, completely different things. And so it feels like to me, like I'm looking at Iowa, and I feel like there's a lot of fans that are Iowa fans this year that are a lot higher on this team than I am in some spots. Like I am worried about what Iowa is, and I was going to come off, playing Iowa State not too in a couple weeks before that, and it just I don't know what Iowa's going to be. Iowa has to reload a lot on the defensive side. It has to break in a quarterback that's coming off an injury who hasn't played FBS football, and it's working a lot of spots out. So I feel like going to Piscataway in a team that's probably 3-0 and feeling good about themselves is more dangerous and more of a gettable spot for Rutgers than traveling out to Seattle.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at that game in 2022, if Iowa couldn't move the ball at all
No.
until like the end, which is why that pick six was so critical that you mentioned, and the the fans are going to be crazy. Like New Jerseyans are very emotional people. right? They're going to ride the high like nobody, but they're also going to crash and burn like nobody,
Mhm.
right? And now that I don't live there, it's easier even for me to see that. And so if they're coming to that game like on a 3-0 streak, then the crowd, the atmosphere is going to be raucous, especially for a Friday night game. The one thing I'll give you one other reason you should feel a little bit more confident is that Iowa faces, who they've played before, Rutgers, right?
They have, off the top of my head, um,
All right, I'll tell you. They
Albany,
got
UMass.
UMass. Okay.
Yes.
You know who the UMass head coach is? Joe Harasimiak. I actually grew up with him in
Oh,
New
that's awesome.
Jersey. And he was the Rutgers defensive coordinator last year. So you're going to face the same exact defense 2 weeks in a row. So I know Iowa's not known for
Mhm.
their offense, but the calls are going to be the same. The formations are going to be the same. Obviously, Rutgers is a step up in personnel from UMass,
Yeah.
but it's probably a pretty nice dry run from a film study standpoint that they're going to be studying very similar film between the two teams in those back-to-back weeks. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more optimism.
Yeah.
But
I
but
think it's
in general,
that
I see what you're
Rutgers.
saying, and I always think that it helps Iowa that they play Iowa State early on because they really get an emotional test early. Even
Mhm.
unfortunately, they've lost that game more than they'd like to, but that is a real team. It's possible that even though Rutgers is playing two better MAC teams from last year, with the transfer portal era, it's entirely possible they could be two of the worst MAC teams this year.
100%.
So it's
Yeah.
entirely
It's a great
possible
point.
that Rutgers will have not been tested when they come into that game. So I think there's a lot of things that could go into it. I would say I'm optimistic Rutgers could finally get Iowa off their back for the first time ever. They've never beaten the
Yeah.
Iowa Hawkeyes ever. But yeah, I mean, I would have to still feel like this is going to be one that both of us are going to be popping in acids before the game.
Yeah, hey, I tell you what, we'll actually be celebrating my bachelor party out in Deadwood, South Dakota. Um, and that game, I believe, is Friday. Is it Friday night? And it
It's got moved
is,
to Friday night. Yeah.
yeah, it's gonna be a stressful situation. And I feel like it's always like that, Iowa Rutgers. It's whoever runs the ball better, plays a little bit better defense, doesn't make the mistake. It's kind of
Right.
what it's
Turnovers.
become.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I expect Rutgers to have a real shot to get into a bowl game. Obviously, they're going to have to get one, but they have proven, like you talked about, to get a Minnesota, and maybe they get. I think. I mean, it's hard for me to say Purdue and Maryland aren't the bottom of the barrel right now in this conference. In some ways, I feel like Rutgers is above that, so I think 6-6 is really in the cards there. Um, Last question for you:
Yeah.
if you were to say, 5 years down the road, what does Rutgers look like as a football program? Is it in a better spot? Is it Schiano continuing to grow? It's a weird, ever changing landscape of college football, and everybody's still trying to find their footing in it. But maybe 5 years down the road, what does Rutgers look like as a program?
Yeah, I mean, we did a recent episode on Night Watch with Larry Kay, who's the host of that, talking about like what's the ceiling for Rutgers football, and really the ceiling of Rutgers football is what Iowa has been. Wisconsin pre-Dairy Raid. You're talking about a team that most years, if they're just avoiding, controversy, which they generally do in the football program, unlike the athletic program as a whole, assuming that they're revenue sharing, they get a big share of it, which is we don't have an AD for a year, so we don't really know how that $22 million is really going to break down. But I think that if they can stay the course, they're building enough talent that when you look at like college team talent, for example, 247 tracks that
Yep.
the difference between the top 10 is about the same as the difference between number 10 and number 50. So if you can just maintain recruiting classes top 25, low 30s, whatever, and avoid major attrition, you give yourself a shot. And then with decent coaching, then you should be hovering around that mark, which for a team like Rutgers would be a good season is probably 8-4, a bad season is
Mhm.
probably 6-6. You're probably going to have one of those years where everything falls off, like they did when Eric LeGrand was paralyzed in 2010, because otherwise that was the only blemish on Schiano's record before he left the first time. So of course you're always going to have something like that happen, but that's really where I could see it. They're never going to have the money and resources to compete. But maybe you get lucky one year and you strike a 9-3. They're never going to have a schedule like
Yeah.
they did last year to go 10-2, I don't think. But maybe you get lucky. Maybe you sneak in to college football playoff once every 25 years, assuming they expand the field. 12 team might be tough, but that's really what we're thinking is that they have so much stability in this program. Schiano doesn't really want to leave again. We really don't see a scenario where he would unless they hire an AD who hate each other. So, that's where I think Rutgers' goal is. But what do I think they'll be like a Kirk Ferentz, Iowa 8-4 every year? No. Do I think that they'll kind of be maybe one notch below that and kind of fighting in the middle of the Big Ten
Hmm.
pack? Yes, I think that's probably what we're looking at in terms of what's reasonable for this program, which is still way above where they've been since they joined the conference. Like if they can just be as
Absolutely.
good as they were the last 2 years, hover around 500, then that's a huge thing to build another generation of
Hmm.
fans. Where really what you look at Rutgers football history is that you have generations like my age where they're good. Then you have a Chris Esch era where they're throwing for literally they threw for 1 yard in one game, they threw for 8 yards in another game. Like that's just an unwatchable football. And so
Yeah.
you go through these periods and they just need to sustain decent teams that can go into a game thinking they can win for a stretch, and then you'll build your donor base, you'll build your fan base, and that type of thing. And that's really what the hope is now. Yeah, 5 years down the line, we don't know what's going to be like with revenue sharing, but that's what I think. Factoring as many variables as we know is probably what they'll be. In a couple of
Yeah.
years.
Absolutely. Appreciate that breakdown on it. It is something always interesting to look at every program down the line. And I think every program's in such a different spot. It's hard to get a real grasp on it without, talking to someone a little more on the inside and covering them all the time. Well, David, thank you for joining us. We do appreciate you helping break down Rutgers here. Looking forward to that matchup early in Big Ten play. Again, we just talked about it. It's going to be an odd one. It could be a little crazy. Weird stuff happens every year in that one. David, why don't you tell everybody kind of where they can find your content and different places that you're talking Rutgers?
Yeah. So in general, I'm. Are you ready for Brazil at Off Tackle Empire, which is a Big Ten site that probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with, covering all of the Big Ten. And then I'm a frequent guest on the Scarlet Faithful with Aaron Brightman. And then I'm also there's where we do weekly previews. So
Yep.
if you the I mean, I'm not just trying to pat myself on the back. I'm the
No,
only
you're
one who
good.
really does like a X, not even X's and O's, but like a real strategic breakdown going to a game. So if you want to hear our perspective, that's the best place to get it. We're not as close with recruiting and stuff like that. And then on
Yeah.
Night Watch with Larry K, I talk like big picture stuff. We talk about future college athletics. Like we're going to do a retrospective with Zach Guggenheim from Big Ten Huddle of
That's
Rutgers
awesome.
in the Big Ten type of thing. So like we talk more big picture there. On Aaron's podcast, I'm usually more like specifics, like game preview stuff like that. And then Off Tackle Empire, it's mostly a comedic way of looking at punting in the Big Ten and things like that. So
Yeah, for
that's
sure.
really where you can find me. But if you want to move to the Carolinas and buy a house, or Florida, I'm also licensed there. Like find me that way too.
Hey, never been out to the Carolinas. That's on the list for sure. Hoping that sometime I get out to Piscataway. Would love to see the Northeast and what Rutgers looks like in person. Again, thank you, David, for joining us. Do appreciate it. Again, you can find us at Play the Fight Pod on all socials. We are on Apple and Spotify for that. And then you can check us out on our YouTube. We just went over 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Check us out there. Subscribe there. Weekly college football show. Iowa, Iowa State, Nebraska fan perspectives. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Go Hawks.